Hello friends and welcome back to this course titled as British Poetry. Friends, we are on Unit 13 discussing the writer T.S. Eliot. The poem written by Eliot is the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which we have to discuss in today's class. The aspect which we are going to take today for discussion is T.S. Eliot and the web of influence. So, as you can understand from the title, that writer influences many others and is always influenced by many others. So this web of influence, which has, let's say, evolved the poet from the personality of T.S. Eliot, we are going to discuss about all these things in today's 30 minutes lecture. So what are you going to learn today? What will be the course outcome or the lecture outcome? After the completion of this course, you would be able to define the complex web of different influences that motivated Eliot to write the select poem. So what is the complex web of different influences and how did it motivated Eliot to write this poem or the select poem? We are going to learn about all these things now. So without wasting any time, let us now start discussion on this topic, T.S. Eliot and the web of influences. Written in 1911, while T.S. Eliot was studying at Oxford University and published in 1915, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock was Eliot's first professionally published poem and is one of his best remembered today. So, friends, this poem, Prufrock, it was published in 1915, one of the, let's say, most initial poems of Eliot. It was first, let's say, professionally published poem of Eliot and one of the best remembered of the poet. With its publication, Eliot established himself as a key figure in the modernist movement. So, it was a time of modernism, friends, and Eliot was trying to establish himself as a modernist poet. And how, let's see, he has explained the modernism through this poem, Prufrock, we are going to analyze that. This movement sought to upset previous poetic traditions and interpretations of society and men to make it new, make it difficult. Friends, this was the phrase given by Ezra Pound, that when you are writing a poetry, you have to make it new, make it difficult. And this was, let's say, the motto of all the modernists of the time of T.S. Eliot. So, the poetic tradition and interpretation of the society and men, which these modernists have done, that is completely different from the poetic tradition. And the challenge the optimistic and highly structured poetry of Romantic movement predominantly at the time. So, when we talk about the modernist poetry, we see that modernists have, let's say, not talked about the optimistic or the highly structured poetry which Romantic movement had. So, we can say that in the modernist movement there was, let's say, a complete description of disillusionment and defragmentation. It was not as organized or as structured as the Romantic poetry. In his book, The Philosophy of T.S. Eliot, William Scarfe explains that during the time Eliot spent as a student at Oxford, he sought to surround himself with and absorb the knowledge of great philosophers and poets of his time. So, when we look at, let's say, the philosophy of T.S. Eliot as mentioned by William Scarfe, he says that the Eliot's purpose is to compile the tradition of poetry writing. So, whosoever surrounded him at Oxford, he tried to absorb the knowledge of, let's say, those elite people, those great philosophers or the poets, and he tried to compile everything and encapsulate everything in his poetry. And of those before him with the ultimate goal of becoming a philosopher himself. So we can say that T.S. Eliot, other than a poet, is also a philosopher. Why? Because he has clubbed many philosophies into his works. In doing so, Eliot sought to understand his relationship with reality through these teachings and hereby better describe the world around him and explain the way others did. So, Eliot is working like a prophet in this poem, Proof Rock. So, he is trying to understand the relationship with reality through these teachings. Whatever he has learned, whatever theoretical knowledge he has achieved, whether it is related to the real life or different from the real life situations. So, we can understand that T.S. Eliot is trying to describe the world around him and explain the ways others did. Let's say, what is the function of the world? How the world is moving in the, let's say, war time. Eliot is explaining all these things in his poem. One of Eliot's largest influences during these years was English philosopher F.H. Bradley. In studying his work, Eliot took on the point of view proposed by Bradley that reality is dualistic, made up of mind and matter. Eliot, according to, let's say, philosopher Bradley's opinions, said that we cannot say that the world is black and white, but the reality of the world is always dualistic. It is made up of mind and matter. The matter, the circumstances around you, the objects around you, what experiences do you have, and the mind, how your mind is, let's say, working on those experiences. In this philosophy, appearance is simply the world as we see it, and reality, as Bradley defines it, consists of both our experience and interpretation of the world around us. So, T.S. Eliot says that what is the difference between appearance and reality? Appearance means how things are appearing to us in the world. On the other hand, reality is how we interpret those things, that knowledge, those experiences of the world into our thoughts. Another view through which we will explore this poem is this concept of reality is that it's surrealist art. Friends, there was a movement of surrealism at the time of T.S. Eliot. If you Google, you will find various characters of surrealism or surrealist poetry, but we are going to get a glimpse of what this movement was, what kind of art was that, and how the poetry of Eliot is influenced from this movement. According to poet and art historian Gaston Creel, the surrealist art movement was born out of World War I and sought to express the true operations of thought. So friends, what is surrealism? Surrealism, let's say, was a kind of a school, thought school, that talked about the true operations of thought. How the thought process moves ahead to access the creativity of minds subconscious by distorting the appearance of the scenes. And how, let's say, creatively, let's say, the mind is subconsciously working on that. How the mind is distorting the appearance of scenes, how the scenes which are coming in front of us, they are distorted by the mind, and depicting in these, thereby juxtaposing the real and the surreal. So, this surrealist movement, it talked about the differences or the, let's say, contrasts or the juxtapositions between the real and the surreal, the real and the virtual, how we perceive anything and how the thing actually exists. Through the study of Eliot's philosophy and its connection to the surrealist movement, it can be explored that how, through his poetry, Eliot attempted to present not the appearance of the world, but the reality to it. So, Eliot was very much concerned about the, let's say, the reality, to know the reality of the world. Eliot believed that the world appear in a different manner, but let's say, it actually is something different. consisting of our ideas and preconceptions of our world, and will examine how this presentation is reflected by Prufrock's view of his life in his poem. And on the other hand, we also see through this poem that what Prufrock's life actually is and how Prufrock is, let's say, portraying his life. So, this reality and artificiality is something which has concerned Eliot very much in this poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. The enigmatic opening scene of Eliot's poem, Let Us Go Then You and I, has generated much speculation in the part of critics and biographers. When friends, critics read this poem and they came in association with the very first line, which says, let us go then you and I, they became very much confused that what is the meaning or what is the interpretation of this line. Like many dramatic monologues, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock addresses an unseen listener. Friends, this poem is a dramatic monologue, and as you have studied many dramatic monologues earlier, you know that there is one speaker in the monologue, which is Prufrock in the reference of this poem, and Prufrock is addressing to the unseen listener. And who is this unseen listener? The people whom Prufrock want to come in his life because he is alone, he has no one to take care of him, and he is, let's say, under depression. Prufrock, however, is unusual in that the listener remains not only unseen but unidentified throughout. So we see, friends, in the poem that Prufrock is living a kind of, let's say, unusual life. He is in an unusual condition. So he doesn't know that whether the listeners who are, let's say, listening to him, where the unseen listeners, whether they will be able to identify Prufrock or not in this poem. In an interview in 1962, however, Eliot gave a very different explanation, saying that Prufrock was in part a man of about 40 and in part Eliot himself. So, when we look at this poem, friends, we see that there was one interview which Eliot gives many, let's say around 50 years after the publication of the poem. And in that interview, Eliot said that Prufrock is a kind of autobiographical poem, and Eliot himself is just like behaving like a Prufrock. Eliot also said that he was using the notion of the split personality, first studied and popularized in his youth. When we move further in the poem, friends, we see that there was a concept of a split personality, and Eliot has well used it. Maybe he is trying to say that Eliot himself is living this dual kind of personality, what he actually is and how he is behaving in the society. So, his hypocrisy is coming out through this poem, which was first studied and popularized when Eliot was very young. While it is unclear which interpretation is closer to the truth, Eliot's writing of Prufrock did coincide with major developments in behavioral science. So, when we, friends, use this poem, this is not only a part of English literature but psychology as well, because this is the, let's say, study of behavior of a person. So, how human beings think, what kind of life human beings are living. The interpretations are closer to the truth of the human society, and Eliot is writing this poem so that he can go deep into the human thinking. During the late 19th century, the study of human behavior and human consciousness became more widespread. So, it was very popular, friends, because recently in 1900, the book Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud was published. And it, let's say, shaped the world. People now started thinking about how human beings think. The philosophy of Sigmund Freud was completely based on the subconscious and the unconscious mind and how they work. Eliot is also trying to make an attempt through poetry in this poem to understand the human consciousness. Experiments were conducted and observations made by a new generation of physicians and scientists, including the Austrian physician Sigmund Freud, giving rise to what would become modern psychology. So friends, the modern psychology was dominating at the time of modernist movement, and T.S. Eliot was no exception to, let's say, being influenced by this philosophy. He was trying to make an experiment to observe the human psychology, the human nature, just like the other physicians and scientists were doing at the time of T.S. Eliot and Sigmund Freud, and thus this poem is also psychological in nature. The 1900s and 1910 witnessed the publication of groundbreaking works like Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams and Carl Jung's The Psychology of Unconscious, which was published in 1912, which further explored the working of human mind. So when we look at, let's say, the works at the time of Eliot, we see that other than, let's say, Freud, Carl Jung was also working on the human psychology, and the book which is published here, The Psychology of Unconscious, also talks about the human mind and how it functions and why it is functioning in a particular manner. It is not known whether Eliot was familiar with the works of Freud, Jung or Buhler during the period when Prufrock was composed, because friends, Eliot was very young, first edition by him, and maybe he was not well read like he became after 20-30 years, but we believe that he must have heard from somewhere about the psychological ideas of Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung and Buhler, like psychiatrists. Nonetheless, lack of certainty has not deterred Eliot scholars and critics from analyzing Prufrock according to the tenets of modern psychology, of speculating whether the you and I refer to unconscious and conscious mind respectively. On the basis of that, friends, psychology, there are critics who try to analyze that the phrase you and I, which comes in the first line of the poem, it means Eliot is talking from the, let's say, unconscious mind, from his conscious mind. So, you and I are the unconscious and the conscious mind of Eliot, and thus there is autobiographical scope in the poem, this love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. A case could be made for Prufrock's mind appearing to function on several levels. One preoccupied with a stifling social mentee and tea parties and polite conversations, another teeming with sensual yearning and erotic fantasies of seagulls wreathed with seaweed, red and brown. So this is a reference taken from line 130 of the poem, suggesting that Prufrock wished to live a dual personality. He wished to live a two-way life. He is a hypocrite person. When he is in the society, attending the parties, he wished to talk about, let's say, social matters. The tea parties, polite conversations used to happen, and Prufrock used to speak in that manner only. But when he is alone, his, let's say, sensual pleasures grow. He is a very sexual kind of person who is thinking about the seagulls wreathed with seaweed, red and brown, because he wants to make relationship with many women, but throughout his life, he was not able to court any women. He was not able to get success in making physical relationship with women. Prufrock displays the two most important characteristics of Eliot's early poetry. Friends, when we look at Prufrock, it is a set example of how Eliot used to think initially. So if we divide the works of Eliot into, let's say, 2 or 3 stages, the first stage will include Prufrock. And from this Prufrock poem, we understand few characteristics about the early poetry of T.S. Eliot. So what are those characteristics? Let us read about them. First, it is strongly influenced by the French symbolists like Mallarmé, Rimbaud and Baudelaire, whom Eliot had been reading almost constantly while writing the poem. Friends, we see that Eliot was more influenced than from, let's say, symbolists of his age as compared to the literary figures. So the symbolists like Mallarmé, Rimbaud, Baudelaire, they have created various, let's say, kind of complex images in the mind of Eliot, and he has utilized them in writing the poem. From the symbolists, Eliot takes his sensuous language and eyes for unnerving and anti-aesthetic details that nevertheless contributes to the overall beauty of the poem. The yellow smoke and the hair-covered arms of the women are two good examples of this. So, Eliot, friends, is, let's say, habituate of taking out the ugly face of the society. He was an anti-aesthetic kind of person, discussing anti-aesthetic details into his, let's say, poems. And the sensuous language which he uses, intentionally uses, suggests the, let's say, ugly face of the society. The symbolists too privileged the same kind of individual Eliot creates with Prufrock, the moody, urban, isolated, yet sensitive thinker. When we, friends, look at Prufrock, we see that Prufrock is the set example of the urban people who are moody and who are, let's say, isolated yet sensitive. They think, but they cannot do anything in their life. However, whereas the symbolist would have been more likely to make this speaker himself a poet or artist, Eliot chooses to make Prufrock an unacknowledged poet, a sort of artist for the common man. So, although Prufrock is, let's say, alone, but Eliot wants to make it, let's say, behave like a common man. And thus, the speaker himself, whether it is poet or artist, Eliot is choosing to make Prufrock as an unacknowledged poet. So, he cannot be a poet, but he is unacknowledged into the, let's say, society. At the end of the slide, you will get a works cited list. There are various references which I have taken in the, let's say, earlier lines, and they are the books or the articles. Let's say the first one by Gaston Cruel, which is the article named as Surrealism from Book Abroad. So you can take the reference of this book to understand more about Eliot's philosophy. Then we have Robert Auclair's book T.S. Eliot. It's an article from the book The Norton Anthology of Modern and Contemporary Poetry, 3rd edition. You can refer to this book also. Then we have William Scarf's book, The Philosophy of T.S. Eliot, From Skepticism to the Surrealist Poetry, Poetic 1909 to 1927. You can also refer to this book for a better understanding of the philosophy of Eliot. So, friends, when we talk about T.S. Eliot and the web of influences, the topic which we have studied today, we very well understand that T.S. Eliot was, let's say, influenced by the philosophers, psychiatrists, psychologists, surrealists, artists, and, let's say, image creators of his society. And all these people created the influence which made T.S. Eliot as one of the most popular modernist writers. That is all for today. Thank you for listening.